When I was a kid in the 90s, I used to hate going to school. There would be at least one day a month where I would wake up and decide to stay home. I would do whatever it took to pretend to be sick, cry, pretend to puke, or even blow myself to the toilet. My parents were working class all-day laborers and couldn't afford to stay home or argue with me. By the time I was in 4th grade, they would let me stay home alone. One morning, I woke up and didn't have to fake it. My stomach was in knots, my throat was on fire, and I couldn't even keep my own spit down. My parents got me a can of chicken noodle soup and set it on the stove, telling me to read the instructions for microwaving if I felt hungry again. Even my sister was gone, running to catch the bus. Despite feeling sick, I was determined to have some fun. I lounged in the recliner and played some of my favorite video games, watched cartoons and game shows, and even ventured around the house a bit. My room was on the 2nd floor, but I had my own bookshelf, TV, and PlayStation, as well as my own bathroom upstairs. The only thing that required me to go downstairs was to find something to eat. The bathroom upstairs was around the corner from my room at the end of the hall and creeped me out from day one. I personally believed in ghosts and would scare myself and my friends whenever they came over. Being home alone and needing to take a leak, I decided to go downstairs to use the bathroom and investigate our fridge. As I got up, I saw something weird out of the side of my eye. It looked like a big looming man in the corner of the hall. Spooked, I booked it downstairs and waited, but heard nothing. I went into the bathroom and did my business, then headed to the kitchen. The fridge was right beside our front door, and as I was looking inside, I heard a jingling. The front doorknob was wiggling back and forth. It's locked. Thank God, but still, I knew immediately that this was not anyone that lived here. Beside the door is a big window, and something moved back and forth beyond the curtain. I watched in total horror as some skinny old guy leaned over with his hands cupped to the glass and peered inside. His eyes went left, then right, and fell on me. A big awful smile stretched across his face, and he tapped on the glass like I was some animal at the zoo. I slammed the fridge closed so hard that I could hear everything shift around inside. For some reason, probably adrenaline, I thought that my mom was going to kill me when she got home, and opened up the fridge and found the booby trap that I just made. I was more worried about that than the guy looking in the window. I was about 10 or 11 when this happened, and I fancied myself a strapping young man in my head. I was also used to staying home alone, and had dealt with a lot of different people coming to our door: electricity and water department workers, gas gauge checkers, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and any other number of people prone to knocking. I ran through a mental checklist as I looked this creep up and down. He definitely wasn't here to see my mom or dad, and definitely wasn't on the clock. He wasn't even knocking. If there's a red flag, this guy was firmly holding it in his hand. "Hey, why don't you come open up the door?" he said, pointing down to the handle. I was just here yesterday. My head starts swimming. What the hell is this guy talking about? Was he here yesterday? Does he work for my dad? Does he know my older sister? I took a step forward because I was so caught off guard. He almost got me for a second. I was about to open up the door out of denial, hoping there was some sort of rational explanation. I caught myself after that first step and shook my head. No way, dude. The old man in the window frowned, his smile gone. "Look, kid, let's not mess things up. Let me in and everything will be fine." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Adrenaline was running high, grabbing the first thing at hand, my sister's old aluminum baseball bat. I stepped closer to the window. "Get away from my house," I shouted, swinging the bat, "or I'll punch you in the face." The old man recoiled, his hand reaching sharply for his belt. I imagined him pulling out a gun, and my heart sank. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a lock-picking crowbar. "All right, asshole, you asked for it," he snarled as he began to break the window frame. I swung the bat at the glass with all my might, shattering it. Shards sprayed in every direction, and the old man howled, clutching his face. I saw blood trickling from between his fingers. Terrified, I rushed out of the kitchen, bat still at the ready. When I reached the stairs, I turned sharply and was relieved to see the old man waddling away, clasping his broken face with his hands. A couple minutes later, police sirens wailed. One of the neighbors had called the cops when they heard the noise. I told them everything as it happened when they arrived. It later turned out that the old man was a burglar who regularly cleaned out houses in our neighborhood. He was arrested a couple blocks away on a blood trail. After that incident, I never missed school for nothing. Now I had a good reason to come home after school. Story 2. My name is Anna, and I am 18 years old now. This scary thing happened to me when I was just 10. Back then, I lived with my mom and dad, and they were still together. Here's something you should know. I don't live in the United States. I won't tell you exactly where I'm from, but it's a place where bad things rarely happen. So this took place on a Friday night. My mom, dad, and 2 little brothers had gone out to buy some new stuff for my room from a store. I didn't feel like going with them, so I chose to stay at home. I spent some time watching TV, but soon, I really wanted some sweets because, well, it was Friday, and I felt like I deserved a treat. I put on my jacket and walked to the closest shop, which was really not far from where we lived. It was about a 10-minute walk. In my country, it's pretty normal for kids around 8 to 10 years old to walk to a shop by themselves, because there's hardly any crime. After I bought my sweets, I was walking back home when I saw a man. He was on a bike and looked like he had drunk too much because he couldn't ride straight. I just looked at him quickly and kept walking, but he made me feel scared. I began to walk faster. Suddenly, he shouted something at me. At first, I couldn't understand him, but then I heard him asking me to stop. I didn't listen and started to run instead. Even though he was on a bike, his drunkenness made it hard for him to follow me quickly. Near our house, there's a small forest that has a path through it. If you take this path, you can get home faster. So when I heard the man shouting, I ran into the forest path. Just after I made my turn, he zoomed past the entrance of the path, but then he saw me running. He shouted at me once more, but this time, I didn't look back. I kept running until I reached my house, hurried inside, and locked the door right away. Our living room has 2 big windows that let you see the front yard clearly. I didn't turn on any lights. Trying to be as quiet as possible, I went to the living room. I was out of breath, and my heart felt like it was going to burst because I had run so fast. I had never been so scared in my life. I sneaked up to one of the windows and peeked through the blinds very carefully. I almost jumped out of my skin when I saw him. He was right there, standing just outside our door. He must have seen the blinds move because he started knocking on the door. I was frozen with fear and didn't know what to do. I thought about calling my mom to tell her what was happening. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest, and I was trying to figure out what to do next when, luckily, our neighbor drove into their driveway. The man at the door saw the car lights, quickly went back to his bike, and rode away. When my parents got back, I couldn't bring myself to tell them about what had happened. I'm not sure why I chose to keep it a secret. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. This kind of thing doesn't happen to me often, but it scared me more than anything ever has. Years later, I finally told my mom about that night. She was really shocked and scared when she heard what had happened. Story 3. Watching videos online or shows on Netflix. This particular event took place when I was around 15. Both of my parents were working and wouldn't be home until the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m. So, I made myself comfortable downstairs, surrounded by my dogs, and turned on the TV. The way our house is designed, there's a couch against a wall. This wall has a back door right behind it, covered by curtains. However, the curtains were shorter at the bottom because my dogs had chewed on them, leaving the lower part of the door visible. One night, as I was deep into watching Netflix in the dark, all my dogs were with me except for Spike. my small dog, who preferred lying near the back door in the kitchen. Suddenly, I heard Spike growling. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Spike often growled at any little thing, even at his shadow, for all I knew. So I told him to be quiet, thinking he was just making noise at nothing, and kept my eyes on the TV. But then, Spike backed into the living room, fur on end and still growling. This sight truly frightened me. I turned to look at the back door, and that's when I saw them. A pair of legs, likely belonging to a man, stood right there at the door. A chill went through me, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. It took me a second to realize this wasn't a trick of my eyes. There was actually someone outside, possibly trying to peer inside or even break in. I quietly made my way upstairs. I dialed the police, who seemed more annoyed than concerned, bombarding me with questions about the man's appearance, even though I hadn't seen anything but his legs. As I mentioned, all I could see were his legs. I rushed to my room, which has a view of the backyard. It was pitch black outside, and since we had no lights back there, visibility was almost zero. But for a brief moment, I caught the glow of a flashlight from the other side of our fence. As I headed upstairs, it hit me. I had no weapon. The only thing that came to mind were the large knives we kept in the kitchen. But that meant I had to go back downstairs. Our kitchen has a window above the sink, and as I went to grab a knife, I froze. There was the man staring in through the window at me. His eyes were wide open, like a hunter eyeing its catch. I couldn't help it. I screamed and dashed back to my room, locking the door behind me. The sounds of banging and my dogs barking filled the house. My heart raced as I realized my dogs were too small to fend off an intruder. If this man got inside, he could easily overpower them, and then me. But I was determined to prevent that from happening at all costs. It felt like an eternity before I heard the police sirens. I hurried downstairs to open the door for the officers, but they found no one. Despite my report of the banging noises, they said there were no signs anyone tried to break in. My mom arrived soon after, furious that the man had escaped. To this day, I don't know who he was or if he was ever caught for doing anything else. I just hope our paths never cross again. Story 4. This story begins almost a year ago. I was 18 years old at that time. My mother decided to go to a music show with her boyfriend on a Saturday night. Her boyfriend, who did not live with us, was visiting for the weekend. He was a student, taking some online courses to finish his college degree. He enjoyed doing his schoolwork in our dining room. The dining room is the first room you see when you enter our house. It has a big window that looks out to the street. My mother's boyfriend would lift the curtains so our two small dogs could see outside. The dogs are quite small, so he only raised the curtains a little, just enough for the dogs to peek outside whenever they wished. So my mother and her boyfriend left for the music show, leaving me alone at home. I didn't really mind because it meant I could watch the big TV in the living room by myself. They were gone, and I settled in to watch some TV. About an hour later, I heard a knock at the door. It surprised me because it was now around 9 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the door's viewer and saw a man standing there, moving oddly, like he was jumping from one foot to the other, as if he was nervous or something. I chose not to open the door and went to the kitchen to grab a knife, just in case he tried to break in. I've learned some self-defense and know how to handle a knife. After calming down for about 20 minutes, I put on my headphones to listen to music and relax a bit more. I like walking around the house while listening to music, so I did. I wandered into the dining room and was about to turn around to go back to watching TV. But that's when I saw him. The man I had seen was now lying down by the dining room window, peeking through the small gap in the curtains that we usually left for the dogs to look outside. He had to pretty much lay flat on the ground to see through that tiny space. We locked eyes for what felt like 30 seconds, and I quickly ran to grab the knife I had taken out earlier. I immediately called my neighbor, who was a police officer, and explained what was happening. He lived just 6 houses away and arrived in about 2 minutes. By the time he got here, the strange man had disappeared. I tried to describe the man to my neighbor, but all I could really remember were his eyes, which wasn't much help. I decided against calling my mom, thinking she wouldn't take me seriously. Then, the very next day, there was a news report about one of our neighbors who was found dead in a pond in my backyard. Everyone thought it was either suicide or an unfortunate accident. But the pond isn't deep at all, maybe 5 or 6 feet at most. It seemed strange to think someone could drown in a pond that shallow. A week later, another shocking news story emerged. It turned out there was a hidden facility for people with mental health issues in our area. This place, just 10 houses down from mine, was home to about 11 individuals, and it was reported that 2 of them had escaped before the police could intervene. Story 5. I was house sitting for my neighbor while they were away on vacation. It was a quiet neighborhood, and I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But one night, while I was watching TV in the living room, I heard someone knocking on the front door. At first, I thought it might be a prank, or maybe just the wind. But when the knocking continued, I started to feel uneasy. I hesitated for a moment, then got up to answer the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. I peered into the darkness, but the street was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been my imagination playing tricks on me. I closed the door and went back to the living room, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard the knocking again. This time, it was louder, more persistent, insistent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to answer the door, but I couldn't ignore it either. With trembling hands, I made my way back to the front door and cautiously opened it again. There was no one there. I scanned the street, but it was deserted. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the door and locked it securely. I tried to convince myself that it was just a prank, or maybe a stray animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound and peering out the windows, searching for any sign of movement. But the street remained silent and empty. As the hours passed, exhaustion finally caught up with me, and I must have dozed off on the couch. But when I woke up, it was to the sound of knocking once again. This time, it was coming from the back door. My heart raced as I crept through the house, trying to stay quiet. I reached the back door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was on the other side. But I knew I had to. With a shaky breath, I twisted the doorknob and pulled the door open. And just like before, there was no one there. I stepped outside, scanning the backyard, but it was empty. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I closed and locked the door behind me. But the sense of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was playing a cruel trick on me, or worse, that someone was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in the living room. The TV turned up loud to drown out the sound of my racing thoughts. I didn't sleep a wink, my eyes darting around the room at the slightest sound. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and frazzled. I couldn't wait to get out of the house and back to the safety of my own home. I packed up my things quickly, eager to put the night behind me. As I locked up the house and stepped out onto the front porch, I paused, glancing back at the empty street one last time. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching me. My blood ran cold as our eyes met. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. I jumped into my car and drove away as fast as I could, grateful to be leaving that house of horrors behind me. Story 6. This all happened just recently in summer this year. I've been living with my parents until I had a good enough job to move out. About 9 months ago, I was finally ready to leave the nest. The place I found wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but it wasn't too bad. Some of my neighbors actually came over to welcome me and gave me some food. There was one neighbor, though, the guy who lived to the right of me, who wasn't exactly welcoming but immediately comfortable with me, like we had known each other for a long time. He'd seen me leaving for work in the morning and run out of his house to tell me random stories, like how the last neighbor used to always turn the bathroom light on at 3 a.m. and leave it on all night, or that they would sunbathe in the garden for 5 hours sometimes. It was all very random, boring facts, and I'd barely get a chance to react to his stories before he was asking me intrusive questions like, "Why did you leave for 83 minutes last night?" It's worth knowing that his voice was a bit odd. He spoke with a very particular inflection every time. He'd say something like an enthusiastic nerd, if that makes sense. Sometimes it made his statements sound like accusations, and sometimes it made them sound like questions, but my response to his comments was never really met with conversation. I would kind of laugh it off and just give him a short answer like, "I had to grab some groceries for tomorrow," but he'd be really quick to interrupt and remind me that the last neighbor never took 83 minutes to grab groceries, and he'd say it with an almost accusatory tone, like what I was saying was ridiculous. I assumed he was just a bit odd, and didn't call him out on his intrusive questions too much. This continued for weeks. He either ran out to come and question me about my day-to-day activity, or he'd come knocking at random hours to tell me facts about my life. He would tell me that he noticed that I left at 8:33 this morning instead of the usual 8:26. I had different ways of reacting to this, sometimes thanking him for letting me know, sometimes being rather dismissive, but always friendly. He was never interested in any other kind of conversation. He'd tell me his observations, and then leave. The months went by, and his behavior continued. Almost every day, he'd stop me in the morning or come knocking to tell me something about his observations. He seemed harmless, so I just let him do his thing. One evening, while I was going for drinks across the road, I asked my neighbor if she ever had any issues with him. She paused almost immediately and looked at me with a serious expression. What happened? She seemed really worried when she asked me. I explained to her that he would approach me constantly to tell me that he'd seen me turning on specific lights in the house at night, or that he'd point out changes in my usual routine. Nothing terrifying, but still creepy. At this point, she turned the music off and put her glass down. "You need to be careful around him." She seemed disturbed, like I triggered a repressed memory. "The people who lived in that house before you were so sweet. I can't prove it, but I know that they're gone because of him." Gone? What did she mean, gone? I pushed her to tell me more, but she apologized and turned the music back on, changing the subject, ending the conversation. She did stop at one point to just make sure I locked my doors and not to invite him at any point that night. As I made my way back home, I watched his house closely as I crossed the road. It was noticeably dark. I never really paid much attention, but I don't think I ever saw his lights on after dark, whereas every other house on the street had at least a few lights in different rooms. I got to my door and paused. I looked towards his house one more time. I saw exactly what I was hoping not to, a glimpse of light. He was peeking at me. How long had he been watching the neighbor's house to know that I was over there? Was this all he did, watch me? I went inside and remembered what my neighbor said. How often did I not even think about locking the door? Honestly, I think most nights I wouldn't even check. I clicked the lock and made my way to the back door. I took the key from the side and made sure it was locked. I put the key back in its usual place and made my way upstairs. As I dressed down into my underwear and made my way under my covers, I reached over and turned off the lamp. It had been a long night, so I started to drift off quite fast. Did I hear that? Was that knocking? I sat on the side of my bed and waited, anticipating more knocks. About a minute passed, and I didn't hear any more knocking, so I assumed I just dreamt it. As I was half asleep, I lay back onto my bed and closed my eyes once again. No, I definitely heard something. I was in a weird state of being half asleep and a little bit tipsy, so I threw the light on. and made my way to the window. I couldn't see anything or anyone outside. The sound of me opening my window was loud enough for any visitor to hear. I called out into the darkness, asking if anyone was there. At this point, any normal person would step into view and show themselves, but nobody reacted. Nothing. I knew that someone was knocking. I threw on my dressing gown and made my way downstairs. I went straight to the front door. It had shaded glass that let me see partially through it. There was clearly a figure standing in front of the door. I was freaking out, but I was also angry. I didn't even consider the danger. I started fumbling with the lock and threw the door open. "You left your house for 157 minutes. What the hell?" I snapped. This was the latest he ever visited. Everything about his behavior had really annoyed me. The fact that I called out of the window and he didn't respond, and instead stood with his nose practically touching my front door. Why did you feel the need to tell me that at this late in the night? I was falling asleep. You've been out very late. I know that. I'm an adult. I'm allowed to go out late. I realized I was reacting to his accusatory tone. Is that all you wanted to tell me? I've been out late. He started to just walk away back to his house. I yelled to him that I didn't want him to knock on my door again. He didn't react, just kept walking towards his house and went inside. I tolerated his weirdness for long enough. I convinced myself I wouldn't let him commentate my life schedule anymore, and that next time he talks to me, I was going to tell him I don't care and just keep walking. I closed the door and went straight back to bed, still frustrated with how intrusive and weird he was. I closed my eyes and imagined what I would say to him the next time I saw him. I felt really tired and had no problems getting back to sleep. As expected, I had the weirdest dream. Whenever I had a few drinks, I'd always have such vivid dreams. I could hear that damn gentle knocking. I didn't awake this time. I almost convinced my subconscious dream state to ignore the imaginary knocking, but I was fully aware of every creepy little thing that was happening. I started wondering if I'd locked the door. I knew I'd locked it earlier, but did not lock it up after I opened it again to confront him. I couldn't remember. I hated how realistic my dreams were. Of all the scenarios I could think about, did I really have to imagine him breaking into my house and walking up my stairs? I felt like I'd never been so consciously aware during any of my dreams. I was dreaming that I was locked in place, sleeping on my side with my back to the door. His breathing sounded so real. If it wasn't for the alcohol in my system, I would have definitely woken up. This was by far the creepiest dream I ever had. I dreamed that he was climbing into bed with me, wrapping his arm around my waist and playing with my hair. I felt absolutely disgusted, but the soft touches also felt relaxing and pushed me deeper into the dream. I was urging myself to wake up at this point. My mind kept racing back to the thought that I actually hadn't locked the door. I needed to get up. His breathing was so intense. It felt so real. His touch felt real. This was unlike any dream I ever had. I was urging myself to wake up. I felt paralyzed. Wake up. Wake the hell up. My eyes finally opened, and I could still feel his touch. Why didn't you lock the door? I jumped up. His voice immediately jolted me awake. He was in my bed. I screamed and ran straight down the stairs and out into the night. I was still screaming as I ran across the road and started banging on my neighbor's door. I was freezing, only wearing my underwear and completely barefoot. I banged aggressively on her door and shouted her name until she came down. She opened the door in a daze, and I pushed my way in. I frantically explained what had happened whilst begging her to lock the door and call the police. We washed out of the window. My front door was wide open, just as I'd left it. The cops were on their way, and my friend was comforting me as I got into some of her clothes and told her all of the details. Minutes passed as we stared out of that window. My friend asked if I was sure he was there and it wasn't just a bad dream. I started to doubt myself when we didn't see him leaving. I wasn't the sensitive type, I wouldn't make up that whole scenario out of fear. I had a vivid memory of him lying in bed with me, and touching me, and talking to me. It was real. I know it was. The cops showed up after about 15 minutes, and started to enter the house, guns drawn. We watched intently, waiting for them to bring him out in cuffs. They were in there for quite a while, and I started to think that he locked himself in my room or something. After what felt like forever, the cops started to leave my house. They were alone. He wasn't with them. I couldn't believe it. I was not crazy. He was in my house. I know he was. I made my way outside to speak to the cops and ask where he was, but they confirmed that they found nothing and searched everywhere. I frantically told them that I was not going back into the house with him still in there. That's when the worst thing that could have happened. He walked out of his house. He stood there, just watching. I was freaking out, demanding that they arrest him and insisting that he was in my house. His expression didn't change. He didn't even flinch. He just turned and walked back inside. Yes, I was drunk, and I was pretty emotional at this point, but I couldn't believe that they didn't listen to me. They told me that they'd searched the entire place, and there was no intruder. They said that the person who I claimed was an intruder was clearly in their own home, so I should just go inside and get some sleep. There were no signs of forced entry and no damage or evidence of an intruder, so there was nothing they could do. After a while, me practically begging them to at least go and interview him. One officer did go over and speak to him, but it seemed like a very short conversation. He confirmed that he did come over initially to check on me as I looked drunk, but then went straight home. I was furious, but also terrified. I eventually went back inside and searched the house for any evidence that he was there. I was almost starting to doubt myself until I checked the back door. It was unlocked, and the key was still in the door. I never left the key in the door, ever. He'd left through the back while I was hiding across the street. He'd been in my house, and there was nothing I could do about it. I made my way upstairs after properly locking every door. The sick, fringed creak had made my bed. It was perfectly tidy, and the covers and pillows were placed perfectly. He didn't even rush out after I woke up. He just tittied my bed and then left through the back door. I climbed in and tried to fall asleep, but there was an overwhelming musky smell. His unwashed body had tainted my covers, and his odor lingered all over my room. It took me hours to replace all of my bedding and finally get to sleep. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being violated, but I also doubted the whole night. The police had been inside my house, a bunch of men in heavy uniforms. That could explain the smell, the key being in the back door. Maybe they were checking to see if it was the right key for that lock, confirming that nobody had stolen it. Even the tidy pillows had an explanation. I told them he was in my bed, so it makes sense that they'd throw my bedding onto the floor if they were looking for him. And then maybe one of them just put it back and tidied it up for me. I followed my usual morning routine, and then at 8:30, as I approached my front door, I took a deep breath, anticipating his presence. I left my house and headed towards the road, looking in his direction. As soon as I stepped outside, there he was, walking out of his house to greet me like clockwork. I froze and tensed up, ready to scream or punch him if he got too close. "You're running 3 minutes later than usual. Did you remember to lock your door this time?" Story 7. My neighbor is very weird. He never waves and has a permanent smear on his face. When we moved in, we were told that he was on a certain bad list and that we should call the cops if we see him with kids. One day, he randomly knocked on our door. I'd never spoken to him before, and without even introducing himself properly, he proceeds to launch into his explanation of the reason that he's on the registry. Basically, he claims that he accidentally hurt some kid in a locker room, while they both happened to not be wearing any clothes. He says it was plain old vanilla assault, where both parties just happened to be in their birthday suits. He repeated multiple times that he is absolutely not into children. Then he left without even letting me talk. That was literally my first introduction to him, other than the notification about him when we first arrived. And that wasn't even the creepiest thing about him. At some point, he started building a sign in front of his house. Not like a little poster, it's professionally printed on metal and mounted on two huge posts, like the ones you see outside a store or along the highway. The sign is a picture of a poppy and a long rambling story about how someone ran over his dog on this road 10 years ago. But it's written in a way where he seems to accuse the neighborhood of murdering his dog. Next to this sign, covering his entire fence, is an enormous banner saying, "We miss you." I don't know why it says that, since he lives alone. And finally, an even larger picture of the puppy, which isn't necessary because directly in front of the banner, sitting on a folding car table, is the actual puppy. He must have had the dog stuffed when it was run over. I could see from my window that he would hide behind his fence for literally hours, peeking at the puppy on the table as if he were waiting for someone to mess with it. He did this for days until finally bringing the stuffed animal inside. The puppy and the banner disappeared, but the metal sign was permanent. It stayed up for years until a storm ripped it down. I always wondered what he does with the dog. Did it stay in a closet, or does he keep it out in his house? Well, one day I got my answer. I have a friend who does construction, and funnily enough, he was hired by the creepy neighbor to build a shed. Without even asking, he tells me that the guy keeps an ugly stuffed puppy in the living room like a piece of furniture, and then he talks to it constantly. There were plenty of other creepy things, but the big puppy shrine was the most notable. I never did see him with any children, but I'm constantly on the lookout. Story 8. I'm house-sitting for a colleague while they're on sabbatical, and let me tell you, this place gives me the creeps. It's a sprawling Victorian mansion, old and creaky, with more rooms than I know what to do with. The first night was uneventful, but last night was something else. I was sitting in the living room, grading papers when I heard it. Footsteps echoing through the empty halls. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut somewhere upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old buildings make all sorts of weird noises. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I debated whether to investigate or just pretend like nothing happened and go back to my work. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself creeping up the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the silent house, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sending shivers down my spine. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, my heart racing with each step. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a door standing wide open at the end of the hallway, a faint light spilling out from within. I approached cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached out to push the door open further. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was empty, but there was a chill in the air that sent goosebumps racing across my skin. I could feel eyes boring into me from every corner of the room, watching my every move. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I felt like I was being drawn in, like there was something in that room that wanted me there. I mustered up every ounce of courage I had and stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each passing second, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the slamming doors, all of it. It was like it had never happened. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to leave, to get out of there and never look back. But something compelled me to stay. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that house, something dark and sinister lurking just out of sight. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little noise, every shadow that flickered across the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, that there was a rational explanation for what had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When morning finally came, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I packed up my things and practically ran out the door, never to set foot in that house again. Story 9. I'm an artist, and I often find myself working late into the night in my studio loft. There's something about the quiet darkness that inspires me, the way the shadows dance across the canvas, breathing life into my creations. But lately, I've been feeling like I'm not alone in the studio. It's a subtle feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck that sends shivers down my spine. At first, I brush it off as my imagination running wild in the silence of the night. But as the feeling persists, I can't shake the sense that someone or something is watching me. I try to focus on my work, losing myself in the swirls of paint and the rhythmic strokes of my brush. But every now and then, I catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting glimpse of something or someone lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It's unnerving, to say the least, but I try to push the feeling aside, telling myself that it's just my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But then one night, as I'm hunched over my canvas, lost in the flow of creation, I feel it, a presence in the room, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I freeze, my heart pounding in my chest as I slowly turn around, expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway. And there he is, a figure tall and shadowy, framed against the dim light of the hallway. For a moment, our eyes meet, and I'm paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. But then, in the blink of an eye, he's gone, disappearing into the darkness as if he was never there at all. I'm left standing there trembling and alone, the echoes of his presence lingering in the air like a ghost. I try to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that there's no one else in the studio with me. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm not alone, and whatever or whoever is watching me is not of this world. Terrified, I gather my courage and make my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I peer out into the hallway. But there's no one there, just the empty expanse of the studio bathed in darkness. I want to run, to flee from this place, and never look back, but something holds me back. A nagging sense of curiosity that compels me to stay and confront whatever or whoever is haunting me. With trembling hands, I reach for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dial 911, my voice shaking as I explain the situation to the operator on the other end. Within minutes, the police arrive, their voices echoing through the studio as they search for any sign of the intruder. But they find nothing, no trace of the man who was standing in the doorway, no evidence that anyone else was ever here. I'm left feeling shaken and vulnerable, my sense of safety shattered by the encounter. But as the police reassure me that they'll increase patrols in the area, I feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to put this nightmare behind me and move on with my life. Story 10. I was around 16 years old at the time. It happened in the suburbs of New Jersey, about 8:00 p.m., and completely dark outside. I was alone in the apartment where my aunt and I lived on the 4th floor of a very old apartment building in a very tiny complex. The front doors to the stairwell were supposed to have buzzers and locks. That was a joke. They clearly hadn't been in operation since 1956. When you looked out the living room window, they looked down on the parking lot. The walls were paper thin, and the windows seemed to be single pane because you could hear everything going on out there. You could especially hear when a car arrived. It was second nature to look out the window at the sound of a car, because, well, we're so nosy, I guess. That night, I heard the sound of a very loud pickup truck. My uncles lived just down the road, and both drove pickup trucks and visited regularly, so I got up to check the window to see if it was one of them. This time, it was not. It was a beat-up old Chevy truck with rust all over the place, and inside were 2 teenagers. The second I came to the window, the driver pointed straight at me, as though he absolutely knew who he was looking for and where I was. Now, That freaked me the hell out, and I took a step back. I was about to walk into the other room and just tried to shake it off when there was a pounding on the apartment door. Let me tell you how significant this was for me. I was pretty well liked in my high school. I moved between social groups very easily. I got along with everybody, and everybody got to know me. Part of this, I believe, is because I came into high school with my self-confidence guns blazing. I had spent horrific years in middle school being bullied relentlessly for being a lesbian. When I got to high school, I swore I would never let anyone use that weapon against me ever again. So on the first day of 9th grade, when it was time to get up and introduce ourselves in the class, I said, "Hi, my name is Lucy. I like girls." People were really impressed. They actually loved it. They loved how open I was, and they loved that they could ask me questions about anything. Looking back, part of me wonders if all my cocky confidence blinded me to the fact that perhaps I made myself a target. When I realized I didn't know either of these guys, and that they were not friends playing some kind of weird prank, my heart sank even further. Now, you would think the most common sense thing to do at this point would be to call the police, and you're right, it would be. But of course, that's not what I did. You see, I knew that if I called the police and my aunt found out about this, I would never have a moment to myself ever again. My aunt was already hyper-paranoid about child abductions, child molestation. Pretty much anything she could ever watch on a Lifetime movie turned into concrete fear for her every day. I can't tell you what it took to convince her that I, a 16-year-old, would be okay in an apartment by myself for a few hours in the evening. So of course, my selfish, stupid teenage brain put that in priority over, staying alive. Through the peephole, I could see that one of them had stopped bouncing and twitching long enough to slowly lean his head towards the door, trying to listen for movement inside. I knew this was my chance. The second his ear touched the door, I pulled my hand back and slammed the door right where his ear was and let out the deepest, most guttural shriek that I've ever made in my entire life. He fell backward. His friend tripped over him. They grabbed each other and started fumbling down the stairs. I got all the way to the floor and peeked through the very bottom blinds of the front window to see the truck peeling right out of there, tire smoking. Not one neighbor came out to see if I was okay. And I know they heard me. That was just as terrifying as the experience that I just had. I could hear on a regular basis when my neighbor to the left would sneeze too loudly, but none of them heard me screaming. Yeah, okay. I never saw those guys or that truck ever again, and despite how long I've made this story, the entire incident couldn't have taken more than 8 minutes from start to finish. I completely believe that seeing that bucket full of murder weapons was the moment my brain went into self-preservation mode, and because there was no aftermath, because there were no repercussions, because I didn't talk to this about anyone, it started to feel even less real. Time moved on. I questioned it over and over. Did this really happen to me? But I know it happened. It was just so damn weird and unexpected that my brain didn't have the neat little compartment to put it in. The pestering question is, why? Was it actually random, or was it actually targeted? And they even knew that I was home. All I could think was, the hell? I walked over to the door as quietly as I could, trying to step on the rug and not the wood floor. I leaned to the door without touching it. I held my breath as I looked through the peephole. I couldn't believe what I was now seeing out there in the stairwell. Two very agitated-looking teenage boys. They were twitchy and jumpy, clearly on something, and one of them was holding a Home Depot bucket. And here is where my brain must have snapped into some sort of dissociative panic mode that would come back to haunt me later. In the bucket, there was duct tape, a rope, a hammer, some wood, and a long serrated-looking knife, like the kind you use to cut spray foam to make it smooth. I pulled back from the door immediately. My brain was going 1000 mph. For just the briefest of moments, I thought, there's no way this is real. There's no way they're just carrying a bucket of these murder tools right out in the open for me to see. It's so stupid. This has to be some sort of joke. Yeah, it has to be. I went to the people again to try to get a good look at them. I didn't recognize either one. Let me tell you how significant this was for me. I was pretty well liked in my high school. I moved between social groups very easily. I got along with everybody, and everybody got to know me. Part of this, I believe, is because I came into high school with my self-confidence guns blazing. I had spent horrific years in middle school being bullied relentlessly for being a lesbian. When I got to high school, I swore I would never let anyone use that weapon against me ever again. So on the first day of ninth grade, when it was time to get up and introduce ourselves in the class, I said, "Hi, my name is Lucy. I like girls." People were really impressed. They actually loved it. They loved how open I was, and they loved that they could ask me questions about anything. Looking back, part of me wonders if all my cocky confidence blinded me to the fact that perhaps I made myself a target. When I realized I didn't know either of these guys, and that they were not friends playing some kind of weird prank, my heart sank even further. Now, you would think the most common sense thing to do at this point would be to call the police. And you're right, it would be. But of course, that's not what I did. You see, I knew that if I called the police and my aunt found out about this, I would never have a moment to myself ever again. My aunt was already hyper-paranoid about child abductions, child molestation. Pretty much anything she could ever watch on a Lifetime movie turned into concrete fear for her every day. I can't tell you what it took to convince her that I, a 16-year-old, would be okay in an apartment by myself for a few hours in the evening. So of course, my selfish, stupid teenage brain put that in priority over, staying alive. Through the peephole, I could see that one of them had stopped bouncing and twitching long enough to slowly lean his head towards the door, trying to listen for movement inside. I knew this was my chance. The second his ear touched the door, I pulled my hand back and slammed the door right where his ear was and let out the deepest, most guttural shriek that I've ever made in my entire life. He fell backward. His friend tripped over him. They grabbed each other and started fumbling down the stairs. I got all the way to the floor and peeked through the very bottom blinds of the front window to see the truck peeling right out of there, tire smoking. Not one neighbor came out to see if I was okay, and I know they heard me. That was just as terrifying as the experience that I just had. I could hear on a regular basis when my neighbor to the left would sneeze too loudly, but none of them heard me screaming. Yeah, okay. I never saw those guys or that truck ever again. And despite how long I've made this story, the entire incident couldn't have taken more than 8 minutes from start to finish. I completely believe that seeing that bucket full of murder weapons was the moment my brain went into self-preservation mode. And because there was no aftermath, because there were no repercussions, because I didn't talk to this about anyone, it started to feel even less real. Time moved on. I questioned it over and over. Did this really happen to me? But I know it happened. It was just so damn weird and unexpected that my brain didn't have the neat little compartment to put it in. The pestering question is, why? Was it actually random, or was it actually targeted, and they even knew that I was home? Story 11. About 10 years ago, I lived on my own and didn't have much company. I was quite depressed at the time after losing my girlfriend to a drunk driver. I was enjoying drawing a beer and watching the sunset on the back porch when I saw a large, scruffy man emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as he stumbled towards my house in a menacing way. Living alone, I often used my backyard for target practice, and at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. Instinctively, I rushed to bolt all the doors while frantically dialing the police. What I didn't know was that this intruder had broken in the day before through a basement window and had spent the night squatting there. He had left the basement door unlocked, and at this point, he made his way inside the house and was making his way up the stairs towards me. I gripped my rifle, aiming at the approaching man as he descended the hallway. I shouted at him, ordering him to stop and get on the ground, but he just kept walking towards me. I fired the first round loaded with rock salt, but he showed no reaction. I quickly followed with a rubber bullet to the chest. Yet the drugged-up guy, who was clearly out of his mind, continued advancing. This guy was huge, at least twice my size, and I realized that whatever drugs he had in his body were going to push him through any pain that a rubber bullet would inflict. He was backing me into a corner. I desperately begged him to stop and warned him what would happen, but he just moaned at me like a zombie and shouted, "Shoot, do it." Then he launched towards me. I took my third shot. I can't recall whether it was buckshot or a slug, but it left a gaping hole in his chest. It barely even slowed him down. He kept coming. In a frenzied struggle, he wrestled me to the ground. He was moaning and coughing up blood. Suddenly, he grabbed my face with both of his massive hands and started squeezing my head. It was utterly terrifying. I could feel him trying to burst my skull open like a balloon. I don't know how long it actually lasted, but it felt like forever. Eventually, the injury finally caught up with him, and he died on top of me. I lay there with him crushing me for a few minutes. My energy was completely drained, and I could barely breathe with his weight on top of me. His body was pushing my rifle into my chest, and it was causing me serious pain. While I tilted his body to the side, I was completely drenched in his blood, and I can still remember the overwhelming smell. I'd completely forgotten that I was still on the phone with the operator who had heard our entire exchange, which more or less amounted to me pleading, "Stop or I'll shoot," and the man menacingly taunting. The police arrived soon after, and the incident made it to the local papers. There was a criminal investigation, but eventually I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It turned out that the intruder was wanted for the murder of an elderly couple in Baltimore and had somehow made his way 50 miles up the road into our rural area. Story 12. I've been thinking a lot about sharing my story of a time I was alone at home and felt really scared. It might not sound super scary to others, but for me, it was the first time I ever felt truly uncomfortable and not safe in my own place. This happened a few summers ago when I was in my early 20s. I was studying for my degree online and was working on an assignment one day when someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened the door and saw a man who said he was there to check the apartment for any damage. I live on the highest floor of my building, and the only way out is through the front door. I didn't feel stuck until something scary happened later. I did have some issues with my apartment because of heavy rain a while ago. It had damaged my walls and even caused a light in my ceiling to stop working. I told all this to the man, but he said he needed to come in and see for himself, so I let him in. I should mention I wasn't really dressed to meet someone. I had on a red nightgown, and I didn't realize it was on backward. Looking back, I think this might have led to what happened next. I took the man to my room to show him the damage, and I even let him take pictures. He had a strong accent that made it hard to understand him at times. While he was looking around, I called my mom to tell her about the unexpected visit. I was lying on my bed while talking to my mom, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the man was staring at me in a weird way. I didn't think much of it at the time because I was focused on my call. After I hung up, I showed him the rest of the apartment to check for more damage, which didn't take long. As I was showing him out, he made a comment about my body, asked how old I was, and then took out his phone. He wanted to take a picture with me, which made me feel really uncomfortable. I tried to cover myself with my arms, but he moved them away and even pulled down my nightgown a bit to take more photos. I was really scared but tried to act normal and told him he needed to leave. As I was trying to get him out, he asked for a kiss. I said no, but then he asked for a hug. I didn't know what to do, so I hugged him, and that's when he tried to kiss me. I managed to move away just in time, so he only touched the side of my mouth. I quickly said goodbye and locked the door. Then I called a friend and told her everything. After the call with my friend, I felt a wave of anger and fear wash over me. This man had almost attacked me in my own home, I had faced unwanted touches on crowded trains and unwanted comments on the streets because of how I dressed before. Those times, I could just walk away from those scary people. But this was different. This happened in my home, where there's only one way out. That scared me even more. I called my mom next to tell her what had happened. She was really angry. She asked if the building manager was there when this happened. I told her no. It turned out that the man wasn't allowed to be in my apartment without the building manager. I felt sick to my stomach, so I ended the call with my mom because someone was knocking on my door again. The man had returned, and this time the building manager was with him. I had put on a hoodie by then and just let them in without making a fuss. The man acted as if he didn't know me, and I was too upset and shocked to say anything. After they left, I talked to my mom again. She said we needed to keep the story straight because when she and my dad got back, we were going to the police station to report what happened. And that's what we did. The police told me to write everything down and talk to the building manager. My mom spoke to the building manager before going to work the next day and told him everything. But the manager acted as if I was making it all up, saying that women often claim they were attacked when they're alone with a man and not dressed properly. So nothing was done about it. The man was just quietly moved to work in another building to prevent more problems like this. My family still lives in that apartment. It took me a long time to overcome the fear and anxiety that experience caused me, and to feel okay around my male friends and comfortable with myself again. Now, I ignore the building manager whenever he comes around. He has to tell my parents whenever someone is coming to inspect our apartment, because I refuse to be home alone for those visits. Story 13. My mom and dad were leaving for a weekend trip, so it was up to me, a 15-year-old, to watch over my younger brothers. That day, a big storm was hitting our town, making everything outside look dark and scary. To have some fun and forget about the storm, we decided to play hide and seek in the house. In the middle of our game, I remembered I hadn't taken our dog, Max, out to pee. I told my brothers I'd be quick and left them hiding. While Max and I were outside, I noticed a strange car parked by our house, close to the street. It was a dark car, possibly a Toyota, but I wasn't sure. The rain made it hard to see clearly, and I couldn't tell if someone was inside the car. Feeling uneasy, I hurried back inside, made sure all the doors were locked, and checked every window. I didn't mention the car to my brothers. I didn't want to scare them. Just after getting back in, my phone buzzed with an alert from our doorbell camera. Someone was at the front door. With the storm raging outside, it was odd for anyone to visit. I checked the video and saw a man, probably in his 50s, standing there. Suddenly, he looked right into the camera, his eyes wide open. It sent chills down my spine. I decided not to alarm my brothers. Instead, I suggested we play a quiet game where the quietest one would win a treat. Half an hour later, the man was gone from the camera's view. Still feeling worried but trying to stay strong, I peeked outside from each window. The mysterious car was still there, but there was no sign of the man. Then I remembered I hadn't checked the sunroom yet. Our sunroom was different because you could see outside from any part of it, but that also meant anyone outside could easily see you. As I made my way to the sunroom, the feeling of dread grew. The thought of someone watching from the dark, stormy outside made every step feel heavier. This part of the house felt more exposed than any other, a perfect place for the stranger to have moved to, hidden from the rest of the world by the storm's cloak. When I dared to look through the window again, my eyes met with the man's, hiding behind our air conditioner. I was about to call the police when our eyes locked. I stumbled back in shock, quickly getting up to look again, but he had vanished. I rushed to gather my brothers, dialing 911 as I did. Suddenly, a loud banging on our front door echoed through the house. "I can see you," he shouted, his voice twisted and strange. He laughed darkly, hitting the door even harder. I ushered my brothers and our dog, Max, into the bathroom, whispering for them to be silent. I explained what was happening as I gently held Max's mouth to quiet his barks. Fear gripped me, fearing any noise might lead the man to us. In the cramped bathroom, the sound of our door being forced open filled the air, followed by the man's eerie laughter. The 911 operator assured me the police were on their way and urged us to stay hidden and quiet. The intruder, failing to find us, began rampaging through our house. The sounds of our belongings being smashed and broken were terrifying, but I forced myself to remain calm, painfully aware of how vulnerable we were without any means of defense. I whispered to the operator to ask the police to approach silently. The details blur together in my memory, but I remember hearing the man being restrained by the police. Peering out, I saw him handcuffed, struggling against the officers. Our home was in ruins. My parents cut their trip short and returned home to help us clean and recover from the ordeal. The fear of being alone at home still haunts me, and I doubt it will ever leave. I share this story as a warning. Always be cautious and never open your door to strangers. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Story 14. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together, since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money, and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months, but decided to move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick. But with my extremely low budget, it was hard. Eventually, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. He responded within a few minutes. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it. A couple of weeks later, I packed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than myself, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then, it was almost 8:00 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set up my bed, and by 9:00, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights, but as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty, as in there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay then, went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something. I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped. and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle, and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to the reality that this man I just met had now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger, and I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan lumber out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away. What the hell was that? I confronted him. Evan was stumbling over his words, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me well enough. I understood the concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning. I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open at 9 o'clock. I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside, Evan's bedroom door was open. Evan. I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief. Seeing as things were only getting weirder, I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left, and I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door until Evan appeared in the doorway. "Move," I said. He stared at me emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shot the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it, as Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted. "You forgot this." He held out the last box. "Oh yeah, thanks." I grabbed it from him and climbed back into the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shut him out and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. Story 15. I was just 14 years old, and it seemed like an ordinary night. It was roughly around 9 o'clock p.m. I was at my younger cousin's house, and I was babysitting for the night. Both of our parents had gone out for drinks and weren't going to be back until late. We were just lounging around, sitting in the living room, watching random shows on television. So we're sitting there, and I was feeling really unsettled. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to ignore it and kept watching TV with my cousin, who was happily enjoying my company. The feeling wasn't going away, so I got up and walked to the back door to lock it. When I came back through the kitchen, I realized what was causing my weird feeling. In the window, there was a very decrepit and homeless-looking man just staring into the window, looking at my young cousin. Protective mode turned on. I pretended like I didn't see the guy. I told my little cousin that we needed to go upstairs because our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him to be staying up late. I went upstairs and put him to bed, knowing damn well that there was a man outside that wanted to get in. At the time, I was about 125 pounds and 5'8", and I played football for my school. If I remember correctly, I went downstairs and straight into the kitchen and grabbed one of those meat tenderizing hammers. I turned back to the window where I saw him before. He wasn't there, so I ran back to the front door and checked that it was locked. Both the deadbolt and the knob were locked. I ran back upstairs with my meat tenderizer and went into my cousin's room and sat down in front of the door. He asked me what I was doing, and I said that he didn't need to worry about it and that he should keep his head low. I called the cops and then my dad and uncle. Cops said they would take half an hour and my dad and uncle were 45 minutes away. All of a sudden, I hear a window shatter and the sound of heavy boots walking around on the tiles. I told my cousin to stay calm and hide under the covers. I whispered to him that he needed to stay silent. I could hear the guy walking around downstairs. It was horrifying. I gripped the damn meat tender and waited. About 5 minutes passed, and then I hear the boots walking upstairs. At this point, I was having a freaking heart attack. My cousin's door is no more than 10 feet from the stairs. I heard him opening the doors to my uncle's room, then the bathroom. My cousin's door was next, along the hallway. I was shaking with adrenaline at this point. Suddenly, he decided to walk back downstairs, and I heard him open the door to the basement. 15 minutes later, the police showed up and burst into the house. They came up to our room, and I told them that I heard him go into the basement. They rushed down there and caught the guy without much fuss. It turned out the guy was loose from a mental hospital from the city about 20 miles away. He had the mental age of a child and had broken into a few other houses in the area. I had nightmares for months afterward. Story 16. I live in a small village in the countryside of Oregon. It's a quiet place, mostly known for its farms and friendly neighbors. Nothing much happens here, especially anything scary or dangerous. My home is a cozy house where I stay with my mom and my younger brother, Alex, who's 16. I'm Mike, and I was 13 when all of this scary stuff happened, about a year ago. My mom and Alex had to drive to a city a few hours away to pick up some relatives from the airport. They decided to spend the night in a hotel because driving back in the dark wasn't something they were comfortable with. Even though I was just 13, I'm pretty tall and strong for my age, standing at 5'11", and weighing around 170 pounds, which is not common for boys my age in our village. Now, let me get into what happened that night. I was in my room playing a video game called Brawlhalla, and suddenly, I felt hungry. I decided to head downstairs to the kitchen to grab some food. Our house is designed in such a way that as you walk down the stairs, you can see the living room, the kitchen, and the windows that face the backyard. As I was walking down, I started hearing a scratching sound. We have 4 cats, and they often make such noises, so I didn't pay much attention to it at first. However, as I passed by the window near our front door, I noticed something odd through the blinds. Considering it was around 10 or 11 at night, the sight of someone outside the window was startling. I felt uneasy about checking it out, so I quickly locked the door and rushed back to my room. My bedroom has a large window, and the roof outside is not too high, about 15 feet up, with a generator placed right beneath it. It's pretty easy to climb up there. I've done it a couple of times. After returning to my room and starting to eat while watching TV, I heard a tapping sound. I muted the TV, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. It seemed to be coming from my window. Cautiously, I approached and peeked outside. At first glance, I saw nothing. But then, I spotted someone lurking close to my window on the roof. I recoiled instantly. The person was wearing a black hoodie, making it impossible to see their face. I quickly grabbed my phone and texted my mom, telling her someone was on our roof, tapping at my window. She replied urgently, telling me to make sure all the doors and windows were locked and to call 911 if anything else happened. The night grew deeper, and I tried to settle down for sleep, playing some music to calm my nerves. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard the front door opening. Confusion washed over me since my mom and Alex weren't due back yet. I turned off my music and listened intently, hearing footsteps moving around downstairs. Scared and unsure, I quickly closed and locked my bedroom door. For some reason, I didn't think to call the police right away. Instead, I tried to call my mom, but she didn't pick up. I hesitated to call the police because I thought maybe my mom and Alex had come back unexpectedly. But then, things took a terrifying turn. I heard a man's voice inside the house. He was speaking Spanish, a language no one in my family knows. My heart raced as fear took over. I rushed to hide in my closet, barely breathing, trying to make no sound. The footsteps grew louder, moving around the house, coming up the stairs, checking each room, and then, finally, entering mine. As the stranger moved around my room, I tried my hardest to stay silent. But in a moment of panic, I accidentally pushed something over. The noise was loud in the quiet room, and I knew he had heard it. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The man approached the closet, laughing in a way that made my skin crawl. I realized then I had to make a choice, fight or run. Everything inside me screamed to act. So when he opened the closet door, I didn't hesitate. I charged at him, using every bit of strength I had to bring him down and lock him in a tight grip. It was a fierce battle. He was much bigger and stronger than me, but somehow I managed to overpower him. As soon as I felt him weaken, I released him and sprinted out of the house, running straight to my neighbor's place for help. My neighbors were quick to act, letting me in and calling the police for me. The officers arrived swiftly and entered our home. They found the man still inside and arrested him. Seeing him being led away in handcuffs, laughing at me with a disturbing look, made me feel sick. My mom rushed back home as soon as the police contacted her. I don't know what happened to that man after that night, and frankly, I don't ever want to know. The fear and the memory of his laugh still haunt me, reminding me of the night I faced a stranger in my own home. Story 17. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no street lights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more serene on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke that was odd, as I had never smelled that before around the house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired, even though it wasn't even 7 yet. I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footsteps as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leaped out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway. The one I was in had a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did that. It gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop when they didn't see me in that room. They ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, It would be in the bedroom because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be placed in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone while I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assumed it was an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over. The sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pan, which the police said people often use to smoke meth. So they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple of hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and get motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a foam cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even practiced doing that at my new place, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. Story 18. I was up at our remote cabin for the weekend while my husband was off on a business trip. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just me in the quiet of the woods. But things took a turn for the worse. When night fell, I was getting ready for bed, just brushing my teeth, and getting into my pajamas when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to listen for any other sounds. That's when I saw them, shadows moving in the darkness just beyond the window. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone out here in the woods. I didn't know what to do. I was all alone with no one around to help me if things went south. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to make a fuss if it turned out to be nothing. So I just sat there in the darkness, waiting and listening. The footsteps seemed to come closer, circling around the cabin, as if whoever was out there was trying to find a way in. I felt a surge of panic rising up inside me as I realized that I was completely vulnerable out here in the middle of nowhere. I thought about locking the doors and windows, but I didn't want to make any noise that might give away my position. So I just sat there, clutching the blanket around me and praying that whoever was out there would just go away. But they didn't. Instead, they seemed to be getting bolder, tapping on the windows and rattling the door handle as if trying to find a way inside. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of what to do next. That's when I remembered my husband had left his gun in the cabin, just in case of emergencies. I knew that I wasn't much of a shot, but it was better than nothing. I quietly made my way over to the closet where he kept it, trying to keep my breathing steady as I reached for it. I gripped the gun and checked to make sure it was loaded, my hand shaking as I tried to steady myself. I knew that I might have to use it if things got any worse, and I was terrified at the thought of having to defend myself against whoever was out there. But just as I was about to go back to the window to see if I could get a glimpse of whoever was outside, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears for any other sounds, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rattling at the door, just the quiet of the night. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to go back to bed, keeping the gun close at hand just in case. The next morning, I woke up to find that everything was back to normal. There were no signs of anyone outside the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it had all just been a bad dream. But when my husband came back from his trip later that day, I couldn't help but tell him about what had happened. He was shocked and immediately called the police to report it, just to be safe. They came out to investigate, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if whoever had been outside the cabin had just disappeared into thin air. I'll never forget that night, and I'll always be grateful that I had the presence of mind to grab that gun. It might have saved my life, and I'll never take my safety for granted again. Story 19. I had just finished another exhausting day at the office, and all I wanted was to get back to my condo and collapse into bed. As I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But that feeling didn't last long. As the elevator began its ascent, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing behind me, lurking in the shadows of the elevator. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, but there was no one there. I told myself that I was just tired, that I was seeing things. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as the elevator continued its slow climb, but the image of that mysterious figure lingered in the back of my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see them standing there, watching me. When the elevator finally reached my floor, I practically sprinted out, eager to escape the confines of the small space. But as I stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking as I tried to unlock the door to my condo. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I felt like a trapped animal, cornered and vulnerable. Finally, I managed to get the door open and practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the next few days in a state of constant paranoia, jumping at every sound and suspicious of every stranger I passed on the street. I even contemplated moving out of my condo, convinced that whatever had been in that elevator with me was somehow connected to my home. But just when I was about to reach my breaking point, something happened that changed everything. I was leaving my condo one morning when I noticed a strange envelope shoved under my door. At first, I thought it was just junk mail, but when I picked it up, I saw that it had no return address. Just my name sprawled across the front in an unfamiliar handwriting. My heart raced as I tore open the envelope, my hands shaking. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy, blown-up still from a security camera. And in that photograph, clear as day, was the figure that had been lurking in the elevator with me that night. It was a man, his face obscured by shadows, but I would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Scribbled beneath the photograph were the words, "I'm watching you." In that moment, everything became clear. It wasn't just a random encounter. Someone was stalking me, tormenting me, and they wanted me to know it. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, my stalker was long gone. They dusted for fingerprints, but the envelope had been meticulously wiped clean. It was like whoever was behind this was taunting me, leaving just enough clues to keep me on edge, but never revealing their true identity. The police stepped up patrols around my building, but it did little to ease my fears. I would lie awake at night, plagued by the image of that shadowy figure, wondering when, or if, they would strike again. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no sign of my stalker. Every creak in the night, every unexpected noise made my heart race with terror. I started seeing a therapist to help cope with the trauma, but nothing could shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was never truly safe. Then, one night, everything changed. I was alone in my condo, trying in vain to fall asleep, when I heard a noise coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me again. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, creeping closer and closer. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. This was it, the moment I had been dreading for months. My stalker was inside my home, and there was no one to save me. As the footsteps grew louder, I scrambled for something, anything, to defend myself with. My hands closed around a heavy lamp on my nightstand, and I gripped it tightly, my knuckles turning white. The door to my bedroom creaked open, and there he was, the figure from the elevator, his face still obscured by shadows. He moved towards me with a predatory grace, his footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. I braced myself, ready to fight for my life. But just as he was about to reach me, the bedroom door flew open again, and a blinding light filled the room. Freeze. Police. In a flurry of movement, my stalker was tackled to the ground by a team of officers, their guns trained on him. As they wrestled him into handcuffs, I saw his face for the first time. A man I had never seen before, his eyes wild and crazed. It turns out that the police had been staking out my condo for weeks, using me as bait to lure out my stalker. The whole thing had been a carefully orchestrated sting operation, complete with a fake security camera photo and a hidden camera crew. As they hauled my stalker away, I collapsed to the floor, overcome with a wave of relief and disbelief. It was finally over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for months was at an end. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned the horrifying truth about my stalker. A deranged loner obsessed with me for reasons that still remain unclear. He had been watching me for months, plotting and planning his move, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. I don't know if I'll ever be able to truly shake the trauma of what happened, but at least I can take comfort in knowing that the monster that tormented me for so long is finally behind bars, where he can't hurt anyone else. And as for me, I've learned to appreciate the simple things in life. A good night's sleep, the freedom to walk outside without fear. Because in the end, that's all any of us can really hope for, a life free from the shadows of terror and obsession. Story 20. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do on Monday. I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees always looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak nonstop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock. when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up. But then I remembered the whole storm situation. Who would be outside right now? I went to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and water hit me right away. But when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know. It sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple of minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard, stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy, it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked at the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off and fell asleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside, shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint, muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, my heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and down, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind. What if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seemed like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have done it at that moment. After some thought, this led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack, and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they did.